Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am very pleased today to be joined by Marlene Laruelle, a research professor of international affairs and political science at George Washington University, and also the director of Illiberal Studies. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you for inviting me.
Well, you publish a lot of books, and well, the reason I wanted to invite you today was to discuss your most recent book, which has the title Ideology and Meaning Making Under the Putin Regime. And I will put a link to the book in the description for those who want to get a copy. So I thought, yeah, good way to start is what made you write this book to begin with?
Well, in fact, I've been working on the ideological landscape of Russia for more than 20 years. Right? I began as a student studying Eurasianism already in the late 90s. So I really wanted to do a kind of comprehensive book that will offer an overview of the evolution of ideology in Russia since Putin's arrival in power. And I even go back to the 90s because my impression is that we need time and space, right? We need the chronology and not being only kind of thinking about what has been said last week. And we need to see the complexity of the different groups, the way narratives have been evolving. So I wanted to catch that kind of comprehensive aspect because there have been a lot of great books wrote on the different aspects of ideology in Russia. But I really to try, at least for myself and hopefully for the reader, to have this kind of general overview about how narratives have evolved, who is pushing for them, how do they articulate or how do they contradict with each other, and when we look over 25 years, what do we see?
Yeah, I wrote about on the similar topic. I published a book on Russian conservatism because I found this topic
Absolutely.
fascinating as well. Again, they had a book launch at your university, so. Uh, but I wanted to ask you though, what do you see being the role of ideology in Russia? Because there was throughout the 2000s, this was a very big theme. Also, by academics link close to the Kremlin. That is. They had the Marxism, communism, and again, after the whole ideological framework fell apart with the Soviet Union, they went with this Yeltsin liberalism and westernizing Russia, a bit Peter the Great 2.0. But of course, then this all fell apart as well, and there was this idea that they needed a national idea for a country as large as Russia and with such a complex history. But what do you see being the uh, the the necessity of ideology and what's actually emerging?
Yeah, well, I think so. The way I use the notion of ideology in the book is that I think every country has a form of ideology. I mean, the US has one. I think in Europe, you also have that one. So I'm using it really as a kind of, a roadmap that is shared by the majority of the population. And that is giving us some framework to understand, who we are as a nation, what is our history, what are our kind of feature. And it can be constructive, right? It can be constructivist things, right? We like to play with mythology, but I think it's part of every nation. So I don't think the Russian case is so specific on that. I mean, there is a Russian tradition of spending a lot of time and energy in trying to build that. But I think the kind of nation building aspect is very nothing specific to Russia. And I think indeed, and it's something I try to do in the book, is to show that it's a nation building process also, right? Russia as it is in its contemporary territory never existed before. It's no more the Soviet Union, it's no more the Russian Empire. They had to reinvent a lot of things of what it means to be Russian. So I think the nation process building aspect was a big part of that. And then there was the more kind of political, ideological aspect, which was that I think the regimes was very much shaped when it really structured itself in like late 90s, early 2000 about the fear of a civil war that was there in the 90s, this kind of feeling that Russia would fall apart also as the Soviet Union, and the idea that, you need consensus, that political divisions are dangerous for the country and that the country needs because it's large, because it's multi-ethnic, multi-religious, because in the kind of the national construction, the state is seen as the kind of the supreme element of the national construction. there needs to be at least a minimal consensus of what it means to be Russian and what is the Russian national history. So I think for me, this really a kind of important element, and that's why in the title of the book, I wanted to have meaning making, because I think it's a genuine process of trying to create meaning that makes sense for the majority of the population. And that's why I moved away from, propaganda type of analysis, because I don't think it's capturing the whole spectrum of the project, which was really to make sense of what is Russia now. And then, of course, over the years, the flexibility of the political project got gradually reduced, right? And some options in terms of narrative that were allowed in the early 2000s got gradually kind of marginalized or kind of put aside. And then I think we see gradually the kind of structuring of a narrative that is more and more kind of codified. And so I also wanted to look at that kind of evolution over the years in the book.
One also look at the different utility though of ideology, because after the 1990s, when Russia really became clear it wouldn't be part of the new Europe, there was the different problems with adopting liberal democracy like its Western counterparts as a leading ideology. One, of course, as is suggested in the 1990s, they lost a bit of trust in this and faith in the whole idea of liberal democracy. But it's also the idea that if they weren't going to be part of the West, that they still were going to follow in the West's footsteps, that this would create a perpetual unequal partnership. But also, if you're going to have a divided Europe where you compete for influence in the shared neighborhood, how can you have any soft power if you're just trying to be a poor version of the West, I guess. So I guess my question is, do you see where does the strongest impulse come from? Is it a need for national cohesion? Is it some strategic positioning? Again, very instrumental. Or do you see this as driven by something authentic that is seeking a mission, a purpose, something spiritual to define who you are in the world?
So I think it can be both, right? I don't think you have to choose between one or the other. If you think about what politics is, it's a lot of genuine commitment and instrumental use of them. So I think there is a genuine component about we need a national narrative that make cohesion of who we are as the post-Soviet Russia, and a narrative that make us indeed toward the West and the whole world, that we have a kind of identity. So there is a brand Russia that is identifiable. So that I think was the genuine component. Where I see the more instrumental and the kind of opportunistic aspect, it's how some narratives has been evolving. And that's why in the book I try to dissociate what I describe, because ideology, it means a lot of things, right? It can be very broad, or it can be kind of Marxist-Leninism. You need to read the book and learn it. So the way I deconstruct ideology, that I see you have the worldview that is like your lived experience that help you interpreting the world. And I think on that, it has been a genuine feeling of disappointment and resentment toward the West and the liberal experiment of the 90s. Then you have strategic narratives, which is the moment where the state adapts this genuine worldview to whatever is the situation. Dialogue with the West, tension with the West, opportunity of opening toward the global South. So this narrative, they evolved, but they are still based on this kind of genuine worldview interpretation. And where I see the super opportunistic aspect, it's what we call in social science is topoi, or kind of ideology. So the small kind of, slogan, formula that are used in the Russian talk show, on television, and this one, they are very much evolving, right? They have to be catchy. They work for a few years, then they move away. So you think, Geropa, for example, was one of them, right? So all this terminology that has the goal to be catchy and provocative and kind of summarizing a big idea, that I think is the kind of opportunistic instrumental aspect. But I think there was a genuine, and there is still a genuine project of trying to make sense of Russian national identity, both for domestic purposes, for domestic audience, and as a brand to sell abroad.
Yeah, no, you say, there's genuine demand. And I thought some of the statistics from your books, I think was 79% of Russians responded, yes, Russia does need a state ideology is something, yeah, to bring together some, yeah, cohesiveness about the national idea. Did any of these findings surprise you, or what stood out?
Yeah, I think what was so the book is really about the kind of the political and the intellectual construction, more about the public opinion kind of reception. So I touch the public opinion reception only at the end in the conclusion. But yeah, that survey that we did with some colleagues from Norway before the full-scale invasion, so the survey was done in 2021, was really interesting because that gives you a lot of interesting data about what does the public opinion understand when they say they support a national state ideology, right? What do they mean? Do they mean, and my interpretation is that people are asking the state, right, to give direction and to also give a kind of social order norms. You may move away from the norms, because I think you have in Russia a long tradition of kind of rebellious reaction to the state, but you still want the state to deliver the norm. And then you decide if you adapt to the norm or if you want to bypass the norm. So there is a demand, I think, really grassroots one coming from all the 90s experience and the 2000 of, kind of law and order, social justice, some form of redistribution, some form of moralization. And I think the moral aspect is really important, is that people experience the 90s and therefore Western liberalism as being very amoral or immoral. And the quest for a kind of national narrative and the quest for conservative and traditional values narrative is very much a quest for kind of moralizing the society and the relationship between citizens and also the relationship with the state, because you can still have people asking for, the state to give this kind of direction and still consider that in practice, the state is corrupt, bureaucrats don't do their job well. So the way to deal with that contradiction is to ask for the state to send some moral signaling that the society can do. So I think there is a real genuine demand. The state can reinterpret the demand on its own way for its own kind of security and legitimacy. But I think there is a genuine demand for some form of moral language coming from the state.
But I guess what is the idea then? If I would designing or proposing a Russian ideology or national idea, it would be very complicated because, yeah, not only the vastness of Russia and its diversity within, but how do you accommodate very different, like which Russia are we talking about? Because they often point out, we had the civilizational cradle was in Kiev with the Kievan Rus, and of course it broke apart. They had the Tatar yoke, then they had Muscovy, then you had Peter the Great and his cultural revolution to remake Russia as a European state. Then you had the backlash with the Slavophiles. Then you had the Soviet Union with, canceling history effectively. Then the Yeltsin's 90s. And how can you find an ideological coherence to the extent you can actually develop a common national consciousness to bring together the Russian Federation?
But I think that the challenge is, right, that Russian authorities and this kind of the intellectual milieu around the authorities who have been working on that project had to face is that Russia has went through many different type of identity and had a lot of political rupture in especially the 20th century. And that's why I think the narrative of we are a civilization state is a way to encapsulate both the multiplicity of ethnic groups and the huge space of Russia, and a way to, deal with the multiple political identity of Russia. So it's, of course, in a sense, it's an empty signifier saying that Russia is a civilizational state. You can put everything inside, whatever you want, but in a sense, that's the goal. The goal is to give the population a kind of frame, and everybody will put inside the frame what they really matter for them, right? So it has some form of empty signifier because it's open for reinterpretation. But I think that's the way they have been trying to think that, so insisting on the continuity, on the state as always being the kind of the legitimate core of the nation, and the rest of the national body having to, in fact, follow a state direction. So that for me are kind of has been the key element. And you could imagine, in fact, keeping exactly the same way of framing Russian national identity and having a different political regime than the one we have now. So there are a lot of flexibility, and having this kind of historical rupture is not necessarily a problem in terms of nationhood, right? I'm a French citizen, right? So when I was a child in the French school, we were taught both, the French monarchy and then the French Revolution. One cancelled the other, but it's still presented as one whole, long history of French identity. So I think Russia is also replicating that kind of continuation, and a lot of states have complex identity. I mean, the United States had a civil war, and they still have a very kind of polarized vision of national history. So I think the civilizational language is the way to bypass all these contradictions and trying to tell citizens, well, as long as you agree with our global vision that we are a civilization, and therefore that Western liberalism, as we have experimented in the 90s, is not good for us because we need something of our own, and there also it can be discussed what is of our own, then everybody can come up with whatever they want inside, right? You would have people who would be like, like a Eurasianist, revalorizing the kind of Turkic Mongol identity. You will still have modernists who will be pro-Peter the Great. You will have kind of classic conservative monarchists. You will have Stalinists, right? There is room for all of that, as long as the idea that Russia has to follow the West, that option is not offered, but all the rest are more or less offered, right? So you can be looking at, maybe China is a good model to follow, maybe Byzantium is a good model to follow. All that is still possible in the current kind of ideological construction.
Well, you mentioned before that the morality becomes a key issue, and it's often contrasted with what's happening in the West. Now, this is very, I guess, a common phenomenon in human nature, though, that is, we define ourselves in groups. If you define who we are, us, they also always need to be mirrored by them, the othering, like who are you not? And indeed, we would do this in the West as well. Russia is often the ideal other for us, so we can, we are a liberal democracy, and if they're authoritarian, then that this is how, this is how the superior, inferior, or good, evil can be contrasted. So it's a form of building your own identity as well. So, of course, the Russians do this also to a large extent. That is, if what you're looking for is moral revival, then kind of the West becomes it fits in the role of this decadent other, in which you see the culture wars raging on here, almost gives a lot of free fuel to this othering. Do you see the West playing? What kind of role do you see the West playing, except for this decadent others, which I keep also seeing in the media popping up with increasing frequency?
Yeah, I think indeed the West has been constructed was always constructed in Russian national construction as the main other, and as you said, the West has itself constructed with Russia as the main other, or at the same level maybe, or in a different way as the Muslim other, right, for the West. So I think in the Russian case, you have indeed like the kind of, we are the healthy interpretation of what should be European tradition, so a more conservative one versus the decadent, liberal, progressive West. So that has become the kind of key way of framing the relationship to the West. But you can still find narratives about we are the real Europe, we share Christian values. So if we look toward the past, we share a lot with Europe. If we look toward the future, we want different type of society, but we still share these roots. I think there are still kind of some form of admiration. And if you have strong resentment in Russia against the West, it's also because you had elites shaped by West and seeing the West with admiration, right? In terms of, rule of law, economic development, and the kind of, the traditional European humanistic culture. I think these elements are still very important in Russia kind of construction. And I think what is happening now since Donald Trump came back to power here in the US is this kind of interesting element on the Russian side of thinking, okay, so there is this conservative West that is also anti-liberal or post-liberal or illiberal, that is more favorable, at least to a certain level, to us, and we still have, they have to face the two West, right? The two way of being the West, the conservative West, or the post-liberal or illiberal West and the kind of liberal one. And I think for them, it's really an interesting discussion about trying to situate themselves and see, well, can we really re-engage with the conservative West, right? Is that kind of normalization possible with the conservative West, knowing that now I think the relationship with the global South and the fact that Russia largely reshaped its language or its branding abroad as being the anti-colonial power, so kind of renewing an old tradition that comes from the Slavophile, the Eurasianist, and then of course the Soviet Union, and saying we are partnering with the global West to kind of stop and destroy the kind of Western domination on the international scene. So you see, they have multiple identities to deal with, right? The complexity of the West that shows different faces, and then the relationship with the global South. And I think you have really interesting kind of discussion among some of these Russian kind of academic elites and political elites about how do we make sense of all that and how do we adapt Russia's position toward all these kind of current transformations.
Yeah, you said the Russians want to prove that they're the real Europe, and I find this to be interesting because on one hand, there's a lot of pushback and especially these days with war and everything, animosity towards Europe. But this idea that they're not against Europe, but rather Europe is decadent and Russia represents the real Europe. This is not a new thing either. This has gone, I guess, well through the centuries from yeah the. You can go back to the sacking of Constantinople to, they all how do you see this? Is this still a key issue then in the national idea that they're not contesting Europe, they're actually they're the one preserving it?
Yeah, I think it's a really key element, and I think it's still there even in moment of tension in 2022. You can still find that narrative of being the real West, of hoping that the West one day will realize that Russia is also a version of being Europeans and a certain form of the West. So I think in Russia, you have this kind of really kind of idealized vision of what could be or was the West and is no more. And it's still a very strong element. And as you said, it's come from the Byzantine tradition, it went through the Slavophile. So it's really an important element. And in a sense, you had it also in the Soviet narrative, right? Because Marxism is a Western European construction. And there was always this idea that, well, you need a communist revolution also to arrive at the core of Europe, because that's where the ideology is coming from. So I think this element is still very much present, much more than we want to see it. And in fact, you also see it in the level of public opinion, right? If you ask average Russian, what is your ideal version of what Russia should be in the future, you will have a lot of elements saying we want to be living, having the quality of life, the kind of the culture of the old West, or what they imagine is the real Europe, but being on our own with our own identity, and we are a great power. So these elements are there, but there are still very much people looking toward the West. And I don't think you have any other kind of civilizational identity in Russia that still makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't find a lot of Russians saying we are looking toward Asia and that's our civilizational model. Right? Asia can be, or China can be a strategic partner. It's not a civilizational model. So when they think in terms of kind of, deep cultural roots, it's still Europe. And it can be only, and it's only Europe precisely because I think it's true. Russia is part of Europe in terms of its kind of cultural roots. So it would be very difficult for them to imagine something totally dissociated from Europe. And I think very much also, what I found interesting is how much, especially among the Russian elites, but not only, this feeling that, how is that possible that Europe is losing its own roots and not wanting to fight for them? So there is this kind of genuine Europhilia, right, in a cultural, philosophical sense that still exists in Russia, while at the same time being super critical and opposed to the political construction of Europe.
Yeah, well, this is again, that's a common theme, though, among not just liberalism, but modernity itself. That, again, if modernity is defined by the individualism over the group and the reason over faith and the tradition, then as countries develop, they often ignore those parts. And this is something you saw from Putin's Valdai speeches all the way back to 2013 when he said the
Absolutely.
West was rejecting its Christian roots. And this common, very, I guess, common thing in the literature of all civilizational studies that once you pull up the roots, that's what feeds civilization, and then it is expected to die. So you see this, I don't know, it seems like a common theme. So beyond the geopolitics, you see this as an authentic belief then within if within the Russian, at least the political class.
Absolutely. I think it has a long intellectual tradition, and that's interesting because you also have that fight happening in Europe, right? And in the US between the liberal and the kind of less liberal, anti-liberal tradition. So I think there is currently a fight for the identity of Europe. And so the EU construction tend to present only one side of European history, right? The progressive side. But Europe has a long tradition of non-progressive ideology, of conservatism, of reaction, of fascism, and they are also European tradition, right? So I think there is also this kind of fight about, Europe, EU, let's say EU having difficulties presenting the plurality of its own ideological history into and adding that as an element of plurality, because the EU construction is very much based on kind of a progressive interpretation of liberalism. And so that's why we have, I think, in Europe, all this tension about, the rise of the far right, of illiberal alternative, and always presenting them as kind of, being the hidden hand of Russia, because Russia has been sending these signals about, well, there is another Europe that is there also, and that wants to be heard. And so I think the fight is happening on European soil for real, and not only in Russia's kind of perception of it.
I do find it interesting the role, in the because we do have a bit of a culture war, not just in the United States, it's definitely in Europe now too as well. But on the liberal side in Europe and America, when you look at the world being divided between liberal democracy and authoritarianism, then again Russia plays the traditional role as the boogeyman, which also contributes to unity here. But in this culture war in the West now, when you see the world more being defined by conservatism versus cosmopolitanism, or nationalism versus globalism. This kind of new view, I guess from France, this is Le Pen's language as well. Then suddenly Russia takes a very different role, though. It goes from being the main adversary to being a key ally. Suddenly it's a traditional European Christian country seeking revive its spirituality. It's as opposed to falling into the excesses of liberalism as is often seen. Do you see this? Do you see the Russian, I guess, new search for meaning having this appeal in the West, or is it more Western just opportunism, seeing a powerful ally in the East?
No, I think there is an appeal coming from Russia. Russia, the brand of kind of anti-liberalism, and whatever means liberalism, it can be the political one, the cultural one, the geopolitical kind of NATO one. So Russia has been able to brand itself like that. And I think and that's why for me it's important not to look at that kind of possible convergence or confluence, not as an influence from Russia, but also as non-liberal forces in Europe and the US, also looking for, well, who is on the market of ideas, and finding Russia. So local agencies, right, in Europe and in the US also found Russia, not only Russia kind of influenced them. They were also interested by what Russia was bringing, and we can discuss that it has nothing to do with what Russia is in reality for those of us who know Russia in reality, but there is this kind of myth or image or brand of Russia as being a strong country that has been one of the precursors in framing this kind of illiberal term. That said, I think that, and we see that now, especially in the US, you can be liberal, and in that case, indeed, Russia is no more your enemy. Russia can be a partner in kind of attacking what you see as the liberal mistakes. It doesn't mean you partner with it, right? So you could totally envision like different illiberal leaders and countries fighting sometimes together against what they see as liberalism, but that doesn't mean they are partnering, because they also have their own tensions, right? And I think the kind of the Trump-Putin relationship is precisely about that now. Is that just kind of they have the same enemy, but otherwise they don't partner, or can they move forward and really kind of try to partner more genuinely? And I think it's unclear. And you see that also in kind of European illiberal forces. Giorgia Meloni in Italy has been a very pro-Trump person, but she's geopolitically much more pro-NATO, pro-Ukraine, and anti-Russia than what we usually see among these kind of illiberal forces, because we tend to often envision them as always pro-Russian, but that's not necessarily the case, right? They could be also pro-American conservatism. That doesn't mean they are pro-Russian. So I think it's just telling us how much the international scene and the ideological marketplace is becoming much more fluid than where we were used to have before. So all the kind of old dichotomy, you know, democracy, authoritarianism, that is kind of in the process of largely collapsing, or at least being so blurry that you cannot really interpret, you know, in which side do you want to put the US now with Donald Trump, right? It's not more the classic liberal democracy. He's himself moving away from it. So I think this fluidity is what is difficult to capture for external observer, because it's shifting all the boundaries. And I think on that, Russia has been a precursor. And Russia is totally fine dealing with that fluidity, right? It's a very postmodern fluidity. They can deal with, you know, the global south. You speak to the far left, you speak to the far right, you speak to Muslim, you speak to Christian, right? You speak to very different audiences, and that works for them. That's the impression. So I think they navigate that fluidity much better than what the West can do.
There seems to be some, again, some repeat in history, because in the 19th century you also had this, well, in Western Europe, when you had the sense that industrialization, that we had, you know, rushing towards the future too fast, we left something important behind. So you had conservatives from Germany, France, United Kingdom, who would go to Russia, which had and essentially seek to recapture some of the things we lost on the way. So again, this I guess this international dynamics quite interesting, but I also do see a lot of the references these days among the more within those trying to frame the Russian ideology, a lot of references to well, obviously Dostoevsky's views, but also Solzhenitsyn. Then whenever I hear the Russian conservatives, I always think of this Solzhenitsyn's 1978 Harvard speech, where he argued that both the communists and the capitalists had doomed themselves by pursuing the modern and material above the spiritual, and they would kind of, you know, with all their antagonism towards each other, they both suffered from the same disease. Not the message they necessarily wanted to hear from him, but this appears to be the essence, I guess, of a lot what you're hearing, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we are still in difficulties at capturing how much Solzhenitsyn got so important, I think, in framing that Russian vision, because it's not necessarily the one the most quoted. But if you look at who is quoted, you would find Dostoevsky, Danilevsky, Leontiev, you know, the classic like Karamzin. Solzhenitsyn not so often, but in fact, when you look in terms of the way the ideas are framed, I think he really had a very heavy footprint in framing that as a kind of, you know, moving away from modernity pattern that has a long tradition in the Russian philosophical space, because it has the spirituality, the kind of eschatological mysticism tradition. So all these things, even if they have largely disappeared from contemporary Russian society, of course, but they are still there, right, in a sense, in the air. So they are this kind of, they sound familiar, even if the kind of intellectual tradition has been lost. I think something remains, and on that, I think Solzhenitsyn was also a kind of precursor on many aspects, with this kind of, you know, anti-consumerism, anti-capitalism, kind of moving away from, you know, abundance of things and going back to something that would be much more kind of, spiritually centered. It has a lot of resonance with a lot of debates that are happening now in what we call the post-liberal sphere, right, including in the West. So I think here also on that, Russia has a quantity of authors who have been, in a sense, precursor of many of that trend, and that who speaks to audiences that are also outside of Russia. So that's why I often think we tend to see kind of Russian influence everywhere, but it's just that Russia has been producing vision of the world that then have circulated by themselves and got some form of resonance, right? If you think also, the current kind of rediscovery of the Cosmism tradition coming from Russia by people in the US around the Dark Enlightenment, aspect. It's also like people have been reading, like the big cosmist Russian names. They have been kind of making some element of them. I mean, so if you study the philosophy of the Silicon Valley, you will find references to Russian cosmists, right? So Russia has been producing a lot.
Well, in the third part of your book, you call it counter-revolution. Now, this, of course, suggests there's a revolution, and yeah, Russia's countering it. So, but this is at the beginning. You write a lot about the rejection of Western universalism, and yeah, I thought this is interesting because this is something that, of course, brings the countries like Russia very close to China, which is also very anti-universalism, and of course one could put India in that box too, perhaps. But what is the essence there, though, of the rejection of Western universalism? So how do you see this?
Well, I think it has here also. It's a long tradition in Russia. It's really coming from German romantic philosophy of the early 19th century that was really feeding the Slavophile tradition already, with the idea that, and that's the civilizationist also narrative, right? That you don't want an abstract universality that would make us all look the same. That would be flattening the world. You want a universality that will be protecting the diversity and the plurality of us. So it's not entirely anti-universal, right? And if you read Dostoevsky, there is both narrative, the civilizational one and the kind of Russia, the kind of messianic, universalistic actor. But it's the idea that we should stay different, and that's what God wanted us to be different. So it has really very deep kind of religious and romantic roots, and that has been, I think, kind of rediscovered and continued. And Paul Robinson just published a book on this kind of civilizationist tradition in Russia of trying to say, don't try to make us all the same. Let's cultivate what makes us different, which is, of course, a way to push away the Western normative pressure that Russia has felt both in 19th century, in Soviet time, and now. So for me, the counter-revolutionary aspect was important because I think the 90s, the fact that Russia received liberalism in all its versions, political liberalism, social culturalism, economic liberalism, geopolitical liberalism, over a few years, if not a few months, it was a revolution. Right, and now we have been facing the kind of the counter-revolutionary aspect of saying, yeah, of course, there are universalistic, some form of universalistic values, and I think Russia has been always saying, like, we want, they are not asking for a full isolationism. They want the international scene, they want the UN General Assembly, but there should be sovereignty of each kind of big civilization of its own. And of course, when you are a big state like Russia, it's easy to have a civilizationist narrative. If you are a small state that feel that you are just part of a sphere of influence of another big one, that's not what you want. But I think that has been a really strong element. And as you said, this civilizationist narrative and the kind of call for sovereignty or return of sovereignty of Russia, that has been key element that helps Russia to speak with the global South. And it's not only China and Russia, it's South Africa, it's Brazil, right? It's a lot of countries in Latin America, Asia, Africa, for whom these arguments are very strong. So they may be critical of Russia on many things, but I think they like to have Russia saying that in front of the West. And that's where Russia is able to create this kind of common narrative with a lot of global South countries. And that has protecting Russia from Western normative pressure and from Western sanctions since the last few years.
Yeah, so the idea of a cultural distinctiveness or preserving it, or now it's referred more in the language of civilizational distinctiveness. This is becoming a bit of a slogan among many of the BRIC states that you need a diversity of civilizations. One shouldn't dictate to others how they should develop. but this also has implication for the world order as well, because the whole principle of when you reject universalism and insist on the distinctiveness of nations or civilizations, that is, everyone has their own path to development. You're also this is also an ideology of sovereignty, though, isn't it? This is the idea that there's no reasons for sovereignty to be diminished.
Yeah, I think the sovereignty argument is a very strong one. There is this idea that supranational institutions cannot be neutral ideologically. They are always representing the power of whoever is the stronger, in our case being the West and especially the US. So any supranational institution would be, in fact, not really like, objectively neutral, but in fact representing the status quo in favor of the US and therefore should be rejected. So we should be back to a kind of, some form of sovereignty, maybe not an absolute sovereignty, because there are also partnerships that can be done. There are some UN institutions that Russia considers really matter, but no more kind of supranational institution that would kind of be diminishing the sovereignty. And here also, I think it's a narrative that speaks a lot in the Global South, because the majority of Global South political culture have been based on the kind of, anti-colonial, anti-imperial tradition. And so once you get your nation from after a decolonizing process, then sovereignty is really important in your political culture. So I think sovereignty can come from the left and from the right. It has been also very important in the leftist tradition. So I think that's also where Russia can speak to different political culture, more right-wing and more left-wing.
Well, you also have a chapter in which you call conservatism as Russia's answer to liberalism. And, how do you define the Russian conservatism? Because conservatism is, again, the assumption that the stability of the present and future must be, anchored in the past. So again, it's the opposite of revolution, where you uproot history and the past itself. But for this reason, you often see conservatism take on different forms. Like in the United States, it's quite a contradictory conservatism, because as a country formed on a liberal revolution, the conservatism becomes a commitment to individualism and often free markets, which the whole it does contradict, not necessarily contradict, but this is what's been attempted to be preserved. But of course, it's very different than how you would define the Russian conservatism. So how do you see Russian conservatism balancing off, or at least presenting an alternative to liberalism?
So I think there are several elements, right, in the conservative tradition. So there is this kind of particularistic kind of civilizational narrative saying like, well, we are who we are with our own roots. We are not a blank page on which everything can be written. We have roots. We belong to a space, to a time, to a genealogy, and that has to be kind of respected. So that's one aspect that is going against the kind of universalism of liberalism. The second element of that conservatism is indeed how we deal with the fact that Russia had many pasts. What do we want to conserve, right? Is that Soviet time? Is that post-Soviet time? And I think the way it has been framed that's what the smartest way probably to do that is to say, well, you know what? Putin's Russia is what we want to conserve, in a sense, right? That is a Russia that would try to be the synthesis of the 90s, Soviet time, and Tsarist Russia, one way or another, a kind of combination of that is that we want. So I think for me, it's very important that conservatism is not asking to go back in time. It's not reaction. It's asking for things to stay as they are and not to move too fast toward new changes. And I think the Russian society, because precisely of the trauma of the 90s, was very much having this kind of, everyday lived experience of conservatism, is that you want stability, you want to know what will be the future, you need some predictability. It cannot change every 6 months, because then you cannot project yourself or your family in the future. So you want stability, and the stability is more or less Putin's Russia of the 2000s, right? Or 2010s, maybe, depending to whom you talk. So that was this idea that it's the best possible Russia, a Russia that accepts the collapse of the Soviet Union, that is globalized, that is a new territorially speaking Russia, but is still kind of integrating the Soviet past, the Tsarist past, and on some form the 90s also. So I think that the way they wanted to frame a conservatism, that was when it really got shaped in the early 2000s. It was still a very moderate and conservatism, and it had many of aspects that could be defined as liberal conservatism, right? It was economically always liberal. On some aspect, it continued that kind of, so on that, it has a moment of dialogue with the American tradition, which, as you said, is the conservation of the liberal tradition, right? At least until Trump changed the political culture of US conservatism. But for very long, that was the US tradition. So I think Russia had that in the 2000s. People who were identifying themselves among the elites as conservative were kind of this kind of soft, moderate, liberal type of conservatism. And then gradually the conservatism became more conservative and kind of less liberal, gave more the room to kind of a more reactionary aspect. And when I use the reactionary in that sense, it's people or ideology who would say, what we have is not enough. We need to go back on some aspects, right? Which is also things you have here, right? That tension about let's keep things how they are, but we don't progress, we don't move forward, or let's, even now it's too liberal, let's go back. And I think you have the same tension now between the kind of the moderate conservative and the more kind of reactionary conservatism inside all this ecosystem of the Russian authorities that are debating what would mean that conservatism. And of course, it's conservatism of the regime, right? So it's regime security, that Putin's regime is the best option for Russia, and so it should be conserved. So you also have the more kind of instrumental aspect that is present in that vision of conservatism as being the best solution for Russia.
Yeah, the whole idea that, you know, you have to build on your past, it also aligns with the other idea that you can't simply copy the West, because then you begin with a fragile structure. And so if you need to integrate your national narrative and consciousness, I don't know, this is how at least I see the conservatism playing out. Well, just for example, with Putin celebrating both the Red Russians as well as the White Russians, for example, where they're, you know, recognizing that these very confrontational, divided parts of Russian history kind of all belongs within the same national history. The last topic in your book I want to address was maybe my favorite one, which is Eurasianism. As you refer to it as Russia's geo-imaginaries. And what is interesting is that the idea of Eurasianism is really becoming front and center. Of course, much of this corresponds well with the ideas put forward by Dostoevsky, that, you know, Russia, which only tried to be European, would be artificial, that it had to find its authentic self by also pivoting into the East. But you also refer to the transcontinental space. What is your view of Eurasia in terms of meaning making, as the title of your book suggests?
Yeah, I think the concept of Eurasia is, of course, super flexible. And so you have multiple ways of interpreting what is Eurasia. You have the traditional way that would be mostly about the internal diversity of Russia itself, and the fact that Russia was historically based on this kind of mixing of the Slavic and the Turkic, and kind of revalorizing the Mongol time as being a positive time where Russia found at least part of its own national identity. So that's the traditional Eurasianist tradition. I think it's still alive when the Russian government is talking about the multinationality of the country and saying that, you know, all ethnic groups are kind of sharing the same common destiny and history together under the leadership of the Russian nation. So that Eurasianist argument is still there. But the other element of the Eurasianist tradition, that would be that Russia, the kind of natural sphere of influence in what was the former Soviet Union and the former Tsarist Empire. I think that element, because it's geopolitically becoming more and more difficult for Russia to assert that sphere of influence, that vision of Eurasia, I think, is declining largely, and it has been replaced by the transcontinental space. So now when the Russian government is using Eurasia, it's very much in this idea of the Большая Eurasia, right? So it's the partnership with China and the opening toward Asia that really matter more than the kind of post-Soviet sphere of influence, which is partly dying, right? So the internal diversity of Russia aspect is always there. The sphere of influence, I think, is disappearing, that part of the narrative. And then it's the partnership with China that takes the form of this Eurasia narrative, inside the BRICS. So it's a way to say, yeah, we are this kind of crossroad. We can talk to one side and the other side, but it's now much broader than just the post-Soviet space, because that has been too much challenged geopolitically, not only with Ukraine, but also with the Caucasus and Central Asia. So I think that version is kind of disappearing, but the other aspects of Eurasia are becoming very important. And it also goes well with the kind of turn toward the global south. If you present Russia as Eurasia, then the way you talk to the global south make it also easier, because you have internal diversity to present, right? So that's all the Islamic diplomacy of Russia, for example, built around the fact that Russia has an important Muslim minorities, plural. And then it's also a way to say, well, we are not only the West or the old West or old Europe, we are also this kind of Asian aspect, and that makes us part of the global South in a sense, paradoxically. So I think that's what Eurasia is so useful now, is that it can take multiple forms, and some are still very much useful and meaningful for the way the Russian authorities are presenting themselves and their own country.
Yeah, well, often they use the term, well, instead of global south, they often use the global majority instead. But
Yes,
but
that's the
I,
Russian
I
framing, yes.
but I did think it was interesting. Yeah, your book, the last chapter, looked on this, yeah, the global south through this anti-colonial prism. Yeah, well, also, yeah, given his Soviet history as well and the decolonization period. But yeah, I usually attend, the annual Valdai meetings, and I recognize that almost every year there's at least one panel or segment which is devoted to the global south and Russia's role in it, and in which they try to position themselves. And there's usually this conclusion, or the discussion is usually organized around the idea that, well, Russia's not, technically the global south, but it's it is pivoting into it, or at least they have a lot in common. Do you see this as do you see anything, read more into this, or is it just that they're associating more with this, yeah, with much of the world, which they then see themselves as contributing to decolonize and liberate?
Yeah, I think they will continue. I think it will be a long trend for the Russian foreign policy, because there is no reintegration in the West that will be happening in any case, even if we would have a peace deal in Ukraine. So I think the kind of there can be normalization of relationship with the West on some aspect, at least with the US. But I think the move toward the global South is really very deep. And it's not only a kind of strategic one, like, okay, we don't have the West now, we have the global South. It's a really genuine vision, interpretation that the world scene has been changing, and that even if Russia could reconcile with the West, do they need it? Is the West still relevant? Right? So I think that's a very strong narrative that comes from the Russian foreign policy expert, that, well, the future of the world is outside of the West, and kind of rebalancing the international institution and the world order. So I think it will remain a long-term strategy for Russia, and that's probably the right one that they have to have if they want to stay a kind of a autonomous great power, even with a kind of declining economic power worldwide, but they can still kind of find their own room if they belong to this kind of multipolar system.
I get the same impression as well. That is over the past centuries, Russia's always either been, pro-Western, anti-Western, but the commonality has always been Western-centric. Well, the feeling I get now is that Russia doesn't want to be pro-Western, it doesn't want to be anti-Western either. It wants the West to matter less, I guess. And by delving deeper into, the greater Eurasian space or global South or whatever conceptual paradigms would go into, that all of this leads Russia towards this idea. Anyways, Professor Laruelle, thank you so much for your time. I could speak with you all day, but I guess you
Thank you
have
so
other
much.
things to do. So yeah, thank you so
Thank
much.
you for your invitation.